"Thanks for giving me kids, but I found someone better. This is the end for us," he said, right there at the family dinner. The words fell like lead weights on my chest, crushing everything I thought I knew about my life. After 43 years of marriage, this was how it ended. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. I live in a pre-war apartment in Queens, New York, where the walls have absorbed decades of laughter, arguments, and the quiet desperation of a woman who gave everything and received so little in return. The radiator still clanks every morning at 6:30, just like it did when we first moved here in 1982. The kitchen table bears the scars of countless meals prepared with love and eaten in silence. That morning started like any other. I woke before dawn, as I always do, and made coffee in the same blue ceramic mug I've used for 20 years. The steam rose in lazy spirals while I stared out at the neighbor's fire escape, where Mrs. Chen hangs her laundry every Tuesday. The routine was my anchor in a life that had slowly drained of color. I remember checking my phone, hoping for a text from my daughter Sarah or my son Michael. Nothing. The silence from my own children had become as familiar as my morning coffee, bitter and hard to swallow. I dressed in the same navy cardigan I'd worn 3 times that week, buttoned it carefully over my faded floral blouse, and shuffled to the kitchen to start breakfast that Robert, my husband, would barely acknowledge. The apartment smelled of yesterday's pot roast and the lavender sachets I kept in the linen closet. These small comforts were all I had left of the woman I used to be, the one who believed that love could conquer anything, that dedication would be rewarded, that 43 years of marriage meant something sacred. I had spent the previous evening preparing for what I thought would be a quiet family dinner. Sarah was bringing her teenage kids, twins named Emma and Jake, and Michael promised to come straight from his law firm in Manhattan. I polished the good china, the set my mother gave me as a wedding gift, and arranged flowers I'd bought with grocery money I could barely spare. The dining room looked perfect, just like I'd trained myself to make everything look perfect, hoping that perfection might earn me the love I craved. But when Robert walked into the kitchen that morning, something felt different. He didn't grunt his usual acknowledgement. He just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, watching me crack eggs into a bowl with a strange expression on his face. I should have known then that everything was about to shatter. You see, for decades, I had lived in a constant state of anticipation. Waiting for acknowledgement. Waiting for affection. Waiting for someone to notice that I was slowly disappearing, piece by piece, into the background of my own life. I had become a ghost in my own home, a woman who existed solely to serve others who had forgotten I was even there. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It was so gradual, so subtle, that I barely noticed it myself. First, Robert stopped asking about my day. Then he stopped looking up when I entered a room. Eventually, he stopped seeing me altogether, except when he needed something. Clean clothes. Hot meals. Someone to handle the bills when his latest business venture collapsed. I remember the exact moment I realized I had become invisible. It was Christmas 3 years ago. I had spent weeks preparing, decorating, shopping, wrapping gifts with care. When the family gathered around our tree, a scraggly thing I'd bought marked down to $5, Robert was telling a story about his childhood. Everyone was laughing, engaged, present. I went to refill the coffee pot, and when I returned 10 minutes later, no one had noticed I was gone. The conversation had continued without me, as if I had never existed at all. That night, after everyone left and the dishes were clean, I sat in my bedroom and stared at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Gray hair pulled into a practical bun. Skin pale from too many hours indoors, tending to everyone else's needs. Eyes that had once sparkled with dreams now dulled by years of disappointment. I looked like my own ghost. But let me tell you about the woman I used to be, because she matters too. I was Margaret O'Sullivan when I met Robert at a church social in 1978. I was 28, working as a secretary at a publishing house in Midtown, and I had plans. Oh, the plans I had. I wanted to write children's books. I had notebooks full of stories about brave little girls who went on adventures, who stood up to bullies, who never let anyone make them feel small. Robert was charming then, in his navy suit and crooked smile. He sold insurance and talked about building an empire, about taking care of me so I'd never have to work again. It sounded romantic at 28. It sounded like love. We married in the spring of 1979, in a small ceremony at St. Mary's on Northern Boulevard. I wore my mother's dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried daffodils because they were cheap and cheerful. Robert's vows were beautiful. He promised to cherish me, to honor me, to love me until death do us part. I believed every word. The early years weren't perfect, but they were hopeful. We rented this apartment when Sarah was born in 1981, planning to save up for a house in Long Island. Robert's business was growing. I quit my job to stay home with the baby, telling myself it was temporary. Michael came along 2 years later, and suddenly I was a mother of two, drowning in diapers and sleepless nights while Robert worked longer hours and came home more distant. I don't want you to think I didn't try. Lord knows, I tried everything. I cooked his favorite meals. I kept the apartment spotless. I supported every business venture, even when they failed spectacularly. When he wanted to invest our savings in a friend's restaurant that went bankrupt within 6 months, I smiled and said it was okay. When he bought stocks without consulting me and lost thousands of dollars, I took on a part-time job cleaning offices to help make ends meet. I was always fixing things. Fixing the refrigerator when it broke. Fixing Robert's mistakes at work when he brought them home. Fixing my children's broken hearts when kids at school were cruel. Fixing everyone and everything except the growing hollow inside my own chest. The money was always tight, but somehow there was always enough for Robert's hobbies. His golf membership at the municipal course. His poker games with the guys from work. His new tools that sat unused in the basement. But when I asked for $20 to get my hair done, or wanted to buy a book, or suggested we go out to dinner, suddenly we were broke. I started keeping a secret stash of quarters in a coffee can hidden behind the flour. Coins I saved from grocery runs, from the lint in Robert's pockets when I did laundry. It wasn't much, maybe $40 or $50 over the course of a year, but it was mine. It was the only money in our marriage that belonged to me alone, and I guarded it fiercely. You might wonder why I stayed. Why I didn't leave when the disrespect became obvious, when the emotional distance grew into a chasm I couldn't cross. The truth is complicated, and it took me decades to understand it myself. I stayed because I believed that love was supposed to be hard work. I stayed because I thought that if I just tried harder, loved better, sacrificed more, he would see me again. I stayed because leaving felt like admitting failure, and I had never failed at anything before. But mostly, I stayed because I was terrified of being alone. The loneliness I felt in my marriage was nothing compared to the loneliness I imagined waiting for me outside of it. At least here, in this apartment filled with unspoken resentments and mounting disappointments, I had a purpose. I was needed, even if I wasn't valued. I was important, even if I wasn't appreciated. Do you understand what it's like to live for decades in a constant state of emotional hunger? To go to bed every night hoping that tomorrow will be the day your partner remembers why they fell in love with you? To wake up every morning disappointed but still hopeful enough to try again? I became an expert at making excuses for Robert. When he missed Sarah's high school graduation because of a work emergency, I told her that his job was stressful and he was doing his best. When he forgot our anniversary for the 5th year in a row, I convinced myself that romantic gestures didn't matter at our age. When he stopped touching me altogether, stopped kissing me goodnight, stopped looking at me like a woman instead of a piece of furniture, I told myself that passion fades in long marriages. I was lying to myself, but I was so good at it that I almost believed it. The children, bless them, were caught in the middle of a marriage that was slowly suffocating. Sarah grew up thinking that women were supposed to be invisible, that love meant sacrificing everything for someone who gave nothing back. Michael learned that men could take and take and take without ever having to give anything in return. I was teaching them, without meaning to, that this was what marriage looked like. That this was normal. Sarah married young, at 23, to a man who treated her much like her father treated me. I watched her fade over the years, watched the light go out of her eyes, and I said nothing. I was too trapped in my own misery to save her from hers. Michael, on the other hand, never married at all. He dated casually but never committed, afraid, I think, of becoming like his father. Or maybe afraid of marrying someone like me. The grandchildren were my salvation for a while. Emma and Jake brought laughter back into our home, at least during their visits. They called me Nana and actually listened when I told stories. They hugged me without being asked and thanked me for cookies I baked just for them. In their presence, I remembered what it felt like to be valuable, to be loved simply for existing. But even that joy was tainted by Robert's indifference. He barely acknowledged the twins, grunting hello when they arrived and retreating to his recliner with the television turned loud enough to drown out their voices. I made excuses for him there too, telling Sarah that Grandpa was just tired, that he loved them in his own way. More lies. Always more lies. The years blended together in a haze of grocery shopping and laundry folding, of birthday cards signed with Robert's name that he never chose, of Christmas presents I bought for people who barely thanked me. I aged not gracefully but desperately, each wrinkle a testament to stress and sadness I couldn't voice. When I turned 65, I asked Robert if we could take a cruise, something small and affordable, just the two of us. I had seen an ad in the newspaper for a 3-day trip to Nova Scotia, and for a moment, I allowed myself to dream. Maybe we could talk without the television blaring. Maybe we could remember why we fell in love. Maybe we could find our way back to each other. He laughed. Actually laughed. What would we talk about for 3 days, Maggie? You don't have anything interesting to say. The words hit me like a physical blow. I went to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror, fighting back tears. When had I become someone with nothing interesting to say? When had my thoughts and feelings become so worthless that the man who promised to cherish me found them laughable? That night, I started writing again for the first time in decades. Nothing fancy, just thoughts on scraps of paper that I hid in my jewelry box. Little observations about the world, memories from my childhood, dreams I'd given up long ago. The words felt rusty, unpracticed, but they were mine. They were the only things in my life that belonged entirely to me. I was 70 when Robert's latest business scheme collapsed spectacularly. He had invested what little savings we had left in some kind of cryptocurrency venture, convinced he would make millions overnight. Instead, we lost nearly everything. Our retirement fund, gone. The money I had saved from my part-time jobs over the years, gone. Even the small inheritance my mother had left me, gone. When I asked him how this had happened, how he had made such a massive financial decision without consulting me, he shrugged and said it was just bad luck. He showed no remorse, no understanding of what he had done to our future. I was 70 years old, and suddenly we had nothing. That's when I got the part-time job at the local grocery store, bagging groceries for $4 an hour above minimum wage. My feet ached every night, and my back screamed by the time I got home, but we needed the money. Robert never thanked me. He never acknowledged the sacrifice. He just expected me to fix his latest mistake, like I'd been fixing his mistakes for 40 years. The other cashiers at the store were mostly young mothers working to make ends meet, and they adopted me like a mascot. They called me Miss Margaret and saved me the less strenuous tasks when they could. During our breaks, they would tell me about their troubles with boyfriends and husbands, and I would listen and offer advice. I became the grandmother they confided in, the older woman who understood what it was like to love someone who didn't love you back. One day, a girl named Jessica, barely 25 with 2 toddlers at home, asked me why I stayed married if I was so unhappy. I had been complaining about Robert forgetting our anniversary again, and the question caught me off guard. Because, I said automatically, marriage is forever. She looked at me with pity. Miss Margaret, she said gently, forever is a long time to be miserable. Her words haunted me for weeks. Forever is a long time to be miserable. Was that really what I wanted? Was that the legacy I was leaving for my children and grandchildren? A cautionary tale about what happened when you gave up everything for someone who gave you nothing in return? But I pushed those thoughts away. I was too old to start over, too tired to rebuild my life from scratch. After 70 years on this earth, surely I could endure a few more years of this quiet desperation. Surely the habits of 4 decades were too strong to break now. I tried to find joy in small things. The way the morning light filtered through our bedroom curtains. The satisfaction of a perfectly folded fitted sheet. The taste of coffee when I added a splash of vanilla extract I bought with my grocery store discount. These tiny pleasures were all I had, and I clung to them like life rafts in a stormy sea. But even those small joys were tainted by Robert's indifference. When I pointed out how beautiful the sunset looked from our kitchen window, he grunted and changed the channel. When I made a joke that made me laugh, he looked at me like I was simple-minded. When I tried to share something I had learned at work or read in a magazine, his eyes glazed over with boredom. I had become white noise in my own home, background static that he had learned to ignore. The breaking point came gradually, not all at once. It started with forgotten birthdays and missed anniversaries, with conversations that stopped when I entered the room and plans that were made without consulting me. It escalated to open dismissal of my thoughts and feelings, to eye rolls and heavy sighs when I tried to speak. And finally, it reached the point where Robert treated me like hired help rather than his wife. He would leave dirty dishes next to the sink and expect me to wash them. He would drop his clothes on the bedroom floor and expect me to pick them up. He would invite friends over without telling me, then act annoyed when I didn't have enough food prepared. I had become his unpaid housekeeper, cook, and cleaner, with none of the respect or compensation that actual employees would receive. When I tried to address his behavior, he accused me of nagging. When I asked for help with household chores, he reminded me that he was the breadwinner, even though I was working too. When I suggested we needed marriage counseling, he laughed and said there was nothing wrong with our relationship that I couldn't fix by being less dramatic. I started fantasizing about what it would be like to live alone. To make decisions without consulting someone who dismissed them. To cook meals I actually wanted to eat. To watch television shows that interested me. To exist in my own space without constantly gauging someone else's mood and adjusting my behavior accordingly. But fantasy was all it was. I was too scared, too tired, too beaten down by decades of being told I was worthless to believe I could survive on my own. The final straw should have been when I found evidence of Robert's affair. It wasn't dramatic or shocking, just a series of small discoveries that painted a picture I had been refusing to see. Credit card statements showing dinners at restaurants he never took me to. Theater tickets for shows he claimed not to enjoy. A receipt from a hotel in Queens, not far from our apartment, dated on a day when he said he was working late. When I confronted him, he denied everything. Called me paranoid and suspicious. Said I was imagining things because I was bored and looking for drama. He was so convincing, so calm and reasonable in his denials, that I almost believed him. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. Maybe I was so desperate for attention that I was creating problems just to force him to engage with me. So I said nothing more. I folded the receipts and put them away, buried the evidence like I had buried so many other hurts over the years. I went back to my routine of cooking and cleaning and pretending that everything was fine, that my marriage was normal, that 43 years of love couldn't be dismissed so easily. But something had changed inside me, some small seed of rebellion that I couldn't quite suppress. I started paying attention to things I had ignored before. The way Robert's face lit up when his phone buzzed with a text message. The way he smiled to himself while typing responses. The way he suddenly started caring about his appearance again, buying new clothes and cologne he didn't wear around me. I wasn't stupid. I had just been choosing not to see what was right in front of me because seeing it would have meant admitting that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies. The night of the family dinner, I had spent hours preparing. I made Robert's favorite pot roast, the one that took nearly 6 hours from start to finish. I cleaned the apartment until it sparkled, arranged flowers on the dining room table, set out the good china and silverware we rarely used. I even wore a dress, navy blue with small flowers, that I had bought on sale months earlier but never had occasion to wear. I was anxious, as I always was before family gatherings. Would Sarah notice that I had lost weight? Would Michael stay for dessert this time, or would he make excuses and leave early? Would the grandchildren hug me and tell me they loved me, or would they be too absorbed in their phones to pay attention to their grandmother? Most of all, I hoped that Robert would be present for once. That he would engage with his family, make conversation, show some pride in the home and wife he had taken for granted for so many years. I hoped that maybe, surrounded by our children and grandchildren, he would remember what we used to mean to each other. I should have known better. Sarah arrived first with the twins, now 18 and applying for college. They were good kids, polite and well-mannered, but they had inherited their grandfather's ability to look through me rather than at me. They hugged me dutifully, thanked me for inviting them, and immediately began discussing their phones and social media and friends I had never met. Michael arrived 20 minutes late, still in his work clothes, with the harried expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. He kissed my cheek and headed straight for the refrigerator, grabbing a beer without asking and settling into the living room recliner that had molded itself to Robert's body over the years. Robert emerged from the bedroom wearing the new cologne that made my head ache and a shirt I had never seen before. He was focused on his phone, typing rapidly with a small smile on his face. When I asked if he could help carry dishes to the table, he held up one finger without looking at me, indicating that I should wait while he finished his text conversation. I stood there in my navy dress, holding a platter of roast beef that was still warm from the oven, watching my husband smile at his phone with more warmth than he had shown me in months. And in that moment, I knew. I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer his priority, no longer his partner, no longer anything more than the woman who cooked his meals and washed his clothes while he built a new life with someone else. But I said nothing. I carried the platter to the table and began serving dinner to a family that barely acknowledged my presence. I filled plates and poured drinks and made conversation that no one seemed to hear. I played the role of wife and mother and grandmother with the skill of decades of practice, even as I felt myself crumbling inside. The conversation swirled around me without including me. Michael talked about a merger at his law firm. Sarah discussed the twins' college applications and her own part-time job at a veterinary clinic. Emma and Jake debated the merits of different universities they were considering. Robert contributed occasionally, but I noticed that he kept checking his phone throughout the meal, his attention divided between his family and whatever digital conversation was captivating him. I tried to join in, mentioning that I had read an article about student loan debt that might interest the twins. Emma glanced at me politely and said, "That's nice, Nana," before returning to her conversation with her brother. I suggested that Sarah might enjoy a cookbook I had seen at the grocery store, but she just nodded absently and asked Michael about his new apartment. I was invisible again, a server rather than a participant in my own family dinner. Dessert was apple pie, made from scratch with apples I had peeled and sliced that morning. I had learned to make pie from my mother, who had learned from her mother, and it was one of the few things I took pride in. The crust was golden and flaky, the filling perfectly spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. I cut generous slices and served them with small dollops of whipped cream I had made by hand. "This looks delicious, Mom," Sarah said, and for a moment my heart lifted. Maybe they did notice my efforts. Maybe they did appreciate all the work I put into making these gatherings special. But then Robert's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it with that same secret smile. He typed a quick response while we ate in relative quiet, the earlier conversation having died out into the comfortable exhaustion of family members who had run out of things to say to each other. I was clearing dessert plates when it happened. Robert set down his coffee cup and cleared his throat, the way he did when he was about to make an announcement. I paused, holding a stack of empty plates, thinking he might be about to thank me for the meal or suggest we do this more often. Instead, he looked around the table at each of our children, at the grandchildren who were now paying attention for the first time all evening, and said the words that would end our marriage. "I have something to tell all of you," he began, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "Your mother and I, well, we've grown apart over the years. We're not happy together anymore." The plates in my hands trembled slightly, but I managed to keep holding them. This wasn't how I had expected him to handle our problems, but maybe he was finally ready to work on our marriage. Maybe he was going to suggest counseling or a trial separation or something that would give us a chance to find our way back to each other. But then he continued, and his next words destroyed everything. "Thanks for giving me kids," he said, looking directly at me with an expression of casual dismissal, "but I found someone better. This is the end for us." The plate slipped from my hands and crashed to the floor, ceramic shards scattering across the hardwood like fragments of my broken heart. The sound was sharp and final, punctuating his announcement with the kind of dramatic flourish that only occurs in real life. Emma gasped. Jake's mouth fell open. Sarah made a small noise of shock, and Michael's beer bottle stopped halfway to his lips. The room was frozen in that moment of devastating clarity, when everyone knows that nothing will ever be the same again. "Robert," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. "Robert, what are you saying?" He looked at me with something almost like pity. "I'm saying it's over, Maggie. I'm sorry, but I'm in love with someone else. Someone who makes me happy. Someone who listens when I talk and laughs at my jokes and doesn't nag me about every little thing." The words hit me like physical blows. Each sentence was designed to wound, to make it clear that not only was he leaving me, but that he blamed me for driving him away. I had been a bad wife, a boring companion, a nagging harpy who had failed to keep her husband's interest after 43 years of marriage. "Dad," Sarah said shakily, "you can't be serious. You can't just end a marriage like this, not in front of everyone, not like this." But Robert was calm, collected, as if he had rehearsed this speech many times in his head. "I've been thinking about this for months," he said. "I didn't want to drag it out or make it messy. I thought it would be better to be honest with everyone at once, to get it all out in the open." Months. He had been planning this for months while I cooked his meals and washed his clothes and planned family gatherings. While I lay next to him in bed each night, feeling lonely but still hoping we could reconnect. While I worked at the grocery store to help rebuild the retirement fund he had squandered, he was planning to leave me for another woman. I knelt down and began picking up pieces of broken plate, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grasp the ceramic shards. The physical action was automatic, ingrained by decades of cleaning up messes, but my mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. "Mom," Michael said, his voice strained, "Mom, leave that. I'll clean it up." But I couldn't stop. I had to do something with my hands, something normal and familiar while my world collapsed around me. I picked up each piece carefully, trying not to cut myself on the sharp edges, trying not to think about what Robert had just said. "Who is she?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anger. "Who is this woman you think is better than our mother?" Robert's expression softened slightly when he talked about her. "Her name is Linda. We met at the insurance company. She understands me, Sarah. She makes me feel young again." Linda. The name hit me like another slap. I had probably answered the phone when she called the house. I had probably been polite to her, asked her to hold while I got Robert, never knowing she was slowly stealing my husband away from me. "How old is she?" I asked quietly, still kneeling on the floor surrounded by broken china. Robert hesitated for the first time since his announcement began. "Age doesn't matter, Maggie. What matters is that we connect on a deeper level than you and I ever did." "How old, Robert?" "She's 48. 48. 24 years younger than me. Young enough to be our daughter." I thought about my own reflection in the mirror that morning, the gray hair and wrinkles and spots on my hands that came with 7 decades of life. I thought about Linda, whoever she was, with smooth skin and bright eyes and the energy to make a 70-year-old man feel young again. I had lost the competition before I even knew I was competing. "This is insane," Michael said, standing up from the table abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone wince. "You can't just throw away 43 years of marriage for some midlife crisis." "Dad, what the hell are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Robert replied calmly, "that I have maybe 15 good years left on this earth, and I don't want to spend them being miserable. I want to spend them with someone who appreciates me." The implication was clear, I didn't appreciate him. I had failed as a wife, failed to make him happy, failed to keep him interested. After 43 years of sacrifice and service, of putting his needs before my own, of swallowing my dreams so he could pursue his, I had failed. Emma started crying quietly, and Jake put his arm around his sister's shoulders. They were 18 years old enough to understand what divorce meant but young enough to be devastated by the destruction of their grandparents' marriage. They had grown up assuming that Nana and Grandpa would always be together, that some marriages really did last forever. "Where will you live?" Sarah asked, her voice small and hurt. "Linda has a nice place in Manhattan," Robert said. "I'll be staying there." Manhattan. He was moving to Manhattan with his girlfriend while I stayed in our old apartment in Queens, surrounded by the memories of our life together. He was starting fresh while I was left with the remnants of our failed marriage. I finally stood up, my knees aching from kneeling on the hard floor. I dumped the broken pieces into the trash can and washed my hands at the kitchen sink, taking my time, trying to process what had just happened. When I turned around, everyone was staring at me, waiting to see how I would react. I looked at Robert, this man I had loved for most of my adult life, and tried to find something to say. Some way to fight for our marriage, to convince him that what we had was worth saving, that 43 years couldn't be dismissed so easily. But the words wouldn't come. I stood there in my navy dress with the small flowers, surrounded by my family, and realized that I had nothing left to fight with. I was 72 years old, financially dependent on a man who no longer wanted me, with no career or savings or independent life to fall back on. I was trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. "I need some air," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I walked to the front door and stepped out onto the landing, closing the door behind me. The hallway smelled of cooking odors from other apartments and the musty carpet that had been there since we moved in. I leaned against the wall and tried to breathe. Behind the door, I could hear raised voices. Sarah and Michael arguing with their father, the twins asking questions that no one could answer. But I couldn't go back in there. I couldn't face them right now, couldn't pretend to be strong when I felt like I was dissolving into nothing. Mrs. Chen emerged from her apartment across the hall, probably drawn by the noise. She was a tiny woman in her 80s, a widow who had lived alone since her husband died 5 years earlier. She took one look at my face and understood immediately that something terrible had happened. "Margaret," she said softly, "are you all right?" I shook my head, unable to speak. Mrs. Chen stepped closer and took my hand, her fingers warm and surprisingly strong. "Come," she said. "Come sit with me for a few minutes." I followed her into her apartment, which was a mirror image of mine but felt completely different. Where my home was cluttered with the debris of a large family, Mrs. Chen's was simple and peaceful. She led me to her small couch and made tea without asking if I wanted any, the ritual of hospitality providing structure when everything else had fallen apart. "Tell me," she said, handing me a cup of jasmine tea that smelled like flowers and comfort. So I told her. About Robert's announcement, about Linda, about 43 years of marriage ending with a casual, "Thanks for giving me kids." Mrs. Chen listened without judgment, nodding occasionally but mostly just being present while I spoke the words that made it real. "What will you do?" she asked when I finished. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't have anywhere to go. I don't have any money of my own. I don't even know how to live without him." Mrs. Chen smiled sadly. "You know more than you think," she said. "When my Henry died, I thought I would die too. We had been married 52 years. But I learned that I was stronger than I knew. You will learn this too." Her faith in me was touching but misplaced. Mrs. Chen had been widowed by death, not betrayal. Her husband had loved her until his last breath, while mine had been planning to leave me for months. The circumstances were completely different. "It's not the same," I said. "Your husband didn't choose to leave you." "No," she agreed. "But the result is the same. You must learn to live alone now, whether you are ready or not." When I finally returned to my own apartment, the family had gone. The dining room table was cleared, the dishes washed and put away. Sarah had left a note saying she would call me tomorrow, and Michael had left his business card with his home phone number written on the back. Robert was in the bedroom, packing a suitcase. He looked up when I entered but didn't stop folding clothes. "The kids took it well," he said, as if he had announced a job change rather than the end of our marriage. "They're devastated," I replied. "The twins were crying." He shrugged. "They'll adjust. Kids are resilient." I watched him pack his favorite shirts, the ones I had ironed and hung in the closet for decades. He was choosing carefully, taking only the clothes that made him look good, leaving behind the old and worn items that reminded him of his life with me. "When are you leaving?" I asked. "Tonight," he said. "Linda is expecting me." Tonight. He wasn't even going to sleep in our bed one last time, wasn't going to give me a chance to process what had happened or ask the 1,000 questions that were swirling in my mind. He was walking out of our marriage as abruptly as he had announced its end. "Robert," I said, "please. Can't we talk about this? Can't we try counseling or separation before you make such a final decision?" He stopped packing and looked at me with something like impatience. "Maggie, I've been unhappy for years. We both have been. This isn't sudden for me, even if it feels that way to you." "I haven't been unhappy," I protested. "I've been lonely, yes, but I thought we could work on that." I thought we could find our way back to each other. There's nothing to find, he said flatly. We've grown apart. We want different things. We're different people than we were when we got married. I'm the same person, I said. I'm older, but I'm the same person who fell in love with you 45 years ago. That's the problem, Robert said, closing his suitcase with a sharp snap. You never changed. You never grew. You're still the same small-town girl with the same small dreams and the same boring conversation. Linda challenges me. She makes me think. She makes me want to be better. Each word was a deliberate wound, designed to make me feel small and inadequate. After 43 years of marriage, he was leaving me with the message that I had been the problem all along. That I had been insufficient, boring, small. That everything I had sacrificed for our family had been worthless because I had failed to evolve into someone worthy of his continued love. What about our grandchildren? I asked desperately. What about Emma and Jake? They love you. They need their grandfather. They'll still have their grandfather, Robert said, lifting his suitcase from the bed. I'm not dying, Maggie. I'm just moving on with my life. He walked toward the bedroom door, then paused and turned back to me. For a moment, I thought he might change his mind, might realize what he was throwing away and decide to stay and work on our marriage. Instead, he said, I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce. Try not to make it complicated. And then he was gone. I stood in our empty bedroom, surrounded by the furniture we had bought together and the photos of our life that he was leaving behind, and tried to understand what had just happened. This morning, I had been a wife of 43 years. Tonight, I was a 72-year-old woman facing an uncertain future alone. The silence in the apartment was deafening. No television from the living room, no sounds of Robert moving around, preparing for another day of ignoring me. Just silence and the distant noise of traffic from Queens Boulevard. I walked to the kitchen and began washing the teacups Mrs. Chen and I had used, then realized I had already cleaned everything earlier. The apartment was pristine, ready for a family gathering that had ended in disaster. I had worked so hard to make everything perfect, and it hadn't mattered at all. That's when I finally cried. Not the quiet tears I had shed over the broken plates, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere I had kept locked away for decades. I cried for the marriage that had died so slowly I hadn't noticed. I cried for the dreams I had given up. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who believed in happy endings and forever love. Most of all, I cried for the realization that I didn't know who I was without Robert. I had been his wife for so long that I had forgotten what it meant to be simply Margaret, to exist for my own sake rather than in relation to someone else. The crying lasted hours. I sat at the kitchen table where we had eaten thousands of meals together, and I mourned the end of the only adult life I had ever known. When the tears finally stopped, I felt empty but surprisingly clear. The worst thing that could happen had happened. Robert had left me for another woman, publicly and cruelly, and I had survived it. I was still breathing. I was still whole, even if I was broken. And maybe, for the first time in decades, I was free. Over the next few days, the reality of my situation began to sink in. Robert moved in with Linda immediately, and suddenly I was alone in our apartment for the first time in 43 years. The silence was overwhelming at first, but gradually I began to notice things I had missed before. The way the morning light hit the kitchen window just right at 7:30. The sound of birds outside that I had never heard over Robert's television. The peace of drinking coffee without someone sighing impatiently nearby. Sarah called every day, her voice tight with worry. Mom, are you eating? Are you sleeping? Do you need me to come over? I appreciated her concern, but her calls felt more like duty than genuine care. She was checking on me the way you check on an elderly relative after a fall, making sure I wasn't lying on the floor unable to get up. She couldn't see that maybe, despite everything, I was starting to stand up in ways I never had before. Michael visited once, bringing takeout Chinese food and an uncomfortable expression. He sat at the kitchen table and asked practical questions about money and lawyers and what I planned to do about the apartment. When I admitted that I didn't know, that I was still processing what had happened, he looked frustrated. Mom, you need to get a lawyer, he said. You need to protect yourself. Dad's not going to take care of you anymore. The phrase stung because it revealed how my own son saw me, as someone who needed to be taken care of, who couldn't manage on her own. Maybe he was right, but I wasn't ready to accept that label yet. I'm not helpless, I said quietly. Michael's expression softened slightly. I know you're not helpless, Mom. But you've been out of the workforce for decades. You don't have credit cards in your own name or bank accounts or any of the things you need to be independent. He was right, of course. Robert had handled all our finances, made all the major decisions, controlled every aspect of our economic life. I had been complicit in my own financial dependency, trusting him to take care of everything while I focused on home and family. What do you think I should do? I asked. Fight, he said firmly. Fight for half of everything. Fight for alimony. Fight for your share of his pension and social security. You earned it, Mom. You more than earned it. The idea of fighting Robert, of engaging in a bitter legal battle with the man I had loved for most of my adult life, filled me with exhaustion. But Michael was right about one thing: I needed to protect myself, because Robert certainly wasn't going to. That weekend, I met with the lawyer Michael had recommended, a sharp woman named Patricia Wolfe who specialized in late-life divorces. Her office was in a gleaming Manhattan high-rise, and she wore a suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year. But her handshake was firm, and her eyes were kind. "Tell me about your marriage," she said, and I found myself reliving 43 years in the space of an hour. She took notes while I talked, occasionally asking questions about property and income and retirement accounts. "The good news," she said when I finished, "is that New York is an equitable distribution state. That means you're entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, regardless of whose name it's in." "What's the bad news?" I asked. "The bad news is that there isn't much to divide. Your husband has made a series of poor financial decisions over the years, and he's cleaned out much of what you had saved. We'll fight for what we can get, but don't expect to be wealthy when this is over." I left her office feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. The legal process would take months, maybe years, and it would be expensive and emotionally draining. But at least I wasn't facing the future completely empty-handed. More importantly, I was starting to feel something I hadn't experienced in decades: anger. Pure, clean anger at Robert for treating me like a disposable commodity. Anger at myself for allowing it to happen. Anger at the years I had wasted trying to please a man who was never going to be pleased. The anger was energizing in a way I hadn't expected. Instead of the crushing weight of sadness I had been carrying, I felt lighter, more focused. I started making lists of things I needed to do, people I needed to call, decisions I needed to make. I opened my own bank account and had my grocery store paychecks deposited there. I got a credit card in my own name, using the apartment as collateral. I bought a cell phone, something Robert had always said was a waste of money, and gave the number to Sarah and Michael. Small steps, but they felt revolutionary. The hardest part was telling people what had happened. Our friends, most of whom were couples we had socialized with for decades, reacted with shock and awkward sympathy. Some of them clearly didn't know what to say to me, suddenly a single woman in their coupled world. Others offered platitudes about how I was better off without him, that felt hollow and dismissive. A few surprised me with their honesty. Janet Morrison, whose husband played poker with Robert, pulled me aside at the grocery store and said, "I always wondered when you'd get fed up with his nonsense. Frank says Robert's been bragging about his girlfriend for months." Months. Robert had been discussing his affair openly with his friends while I was still believing his lies about working late. The humiliation was almost worse than the betrayal. But Janet's next words surprised me. "You know," she said, "I always envied you." Envied me? I couldn't imagine why anyone would envy my situation. "You're free now," she said. "You can do whatever you want, go wherever you want, be whoever you want. Frank and I have been married 47 years, and I love him, but sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had been braver." Free. I turned the word over in my mind as I walked home. Was I free? Or was I just alone and scared and too old to start over? Maybe both things could be true at the same time. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to work and spent the entire day in bed, reading. Not magazines or trashy novels, but real books from the library. I read about women who had left everything behind to discover themselves in foreign countries. I read about grandmothers who had started businesses in their 70s. I read about late-life reinvention and the surprising resilience of the human spirit. I read until my eyes hurt and my back ached from lying in the same position for hours. When evening came, I realized I hadn't thought about Robert or Linda or the divorce once all day. I had been completely absorbed in other people's stories, other people's possibilities. Maybe there were possibilities for me too. The turning point came about 6 weeks after Robert left, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October. I was walking home from the grocery store, carrying bags that seemed heavier than usual, when I saw him. Robert was coming out of a restaurant on Northern Boulevard with a woman I knew must be Linda. She was everything I wasn't. Tall where I was short, blonde where I was gray, confident where I was uncertain. She wore a bright red coat that made her look vibrant and alive, and she was laughing at something Robert had said. He looked happier than I had seen him in years, younger somehow, as if leaving me had taken a decade off his life. They didn't see me. I stood there in the rain, clutching my grocery bags, watching my husband of 43 years with his new love. They looked like a couple in a romantic movie, the kind of people who had adventures and meaningful conversations and passionate fights that ended with passionate reconciliations. I had never been that kind of woman. I had never been dramatic or exciting or challenging. I had been safe and predictable and boring, just like Robert said. But as I stood there getting soaked by the October rain, watching them walk away with their arms around each other, I realized something important. I didn't want to be that kind of woman. I didn't want drama or passion or fights. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. I wanted a life where someone's mood didn't determine my entire day. I wanted to be alone more than I wanted to be with someone who made me feel invisible. That night, I called Patricia Wolf and told her to proceed with the divorce as quickly as possible. I didn't want to fight for alimony or drag out the proceedings in the hope of winning Robert back. I wanted it over so I could begin whatever came next. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You might be able to get more if we take our time and build a stronger case." "I'm sure," I said. "I just want my freedom." Freedom. There was that word again, but this time it didn't scare me as much. The divorce proceedings moved surprisingly quickly once I stopped trying to salvage what couldn't be saved. Robert was eager to make it official so he could marry Linda, and I was eager to close this chapter of my life and start writing a new one. We met once to sign papers, in Patricia's office on a cold December morning. Robert looked uncomfortable in his new expensive clothes, like he was wearing a costume. He had gained weight and lost some of his hair, and I realized with surprise that he looked old. Not distinguished or mature, just old and tired and slightly ridiculous. "You look good, Maggie," he said awkwardly as we waited for the notary. "Thank you," I replied, but I didn't return the compliment. He didn't look good. He looked like a 70-year-old man trying desperately to be young again, and it was sad rather than attractive. "I hope you'll be happy," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. "I will be," I said, and I realized I meant it too. The divorce was finalized on January 15th, a gray winter day that felt like an ending and a beginning at the same time. I walked out of the courthouse legally single for the first time since I was 28 years old, and the feeling was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I celebrated by going to a movie alone, something I had never done before. It was a foreign film with subtitles that I had to concentrate on, and I loved every minute of it. I bought popcorn and sat in the dark theater, completely absorbed in someone else's story, feeling more myself than I had in decades. On the way home, I stopped at a travel agency and picked up brochures for cruises and European tours and train trips across the country. I probably couldn't afford any of them, but looking at the pictures of places I had never been made me feel hopeful about the future for the first time in months. The settlement from the divorce wasn't generous, but it was enough to keep me in the apartment for a while and supplement my grocery store income. More importantly, I had something I hadn't had in 43 years, complete control over my own money. I bought myself a small television for the bedroom, something Robert had always refused to allow. I bought books and magazines and flowers for no special occasion. I bought a warm coat in a color I actually liked instead of the practical beige wool I had worn for the past 5 years. These were small purchases, but they felt revolutionary. Every decision was mine alone to make. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came changes I hadn't expected. Sarah started calling less frequently, no longer worried that I would fall apart without constant supervision. Michael began inviting me to dinner occasionally, treating me like a person rather than a victim who needed to be managed. The twins came to visit on their spring break, and for the first time in years, the apartment felt lively rather than tense. Without Robert's brooding presence, Emma and Jake relaxed and talked to me like I was their grandmother rather than a piece of furniture. "Nana," Emma said one afternoon while we were looking through old photo albums, "you seem different. Happier." "Do I?" I asked, though I knew she was right. I did feel different. Lighter somehow, as if I had been carrying a heavy pack for decades and suddenly been allowed to set it down. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "You smile more. And you're funnier than we remember." Funnier. Robert had always said I had no sense of humor, that my jokes were childish and my observations boring. But the twins laughed at my stories and asked questions about my life that no one had asked in years. That weekend, they helped me rearrange the furniture in the living room, pushing Robert's old recliner into a corner and moving my reading chair by the window where the morning light was best. Such a small change, but it transformed the entire space from his domain to mine. "It looks like a place where someone actually lives now," Emma said, and I knew what she meant. For decades, the apartment had been a museum to Robert's comfort, arranged around his needs and preferences. Now it was beginning to reflect me. Summer brought new challenges and new discoveries. The air conditioning broke, and instead of panicking about the expense, I called a repairman myself and negotiated a payment plan. When the bathroom faucet started leaking, I looked up how to fix it online and managed the repair myself, feeling ridiculously proud of my competence. I started walking more, exploring neighborhoods in Queens I had never bothered to visit. I discovered a community garden where I could rent a small plot, and I spent my summer evenings there, growing tomatoes and herbs that tasted better than anything I had ever bought at the store. The other gardeners were a mixed group of retirees, young families, and immigrants from a dozen different countries. They welcomed me without asking questions about my personal life or making assumptions about what an elderly woman should or shouldn't be doing. I was just Margaret, the woman with the surprisingly productive tomato plants. One evening in July, a new gardener introduced himself. His name was Frank, and he was recently widowed, about my age, with kind eyes and gentle hands that were stained with soil from his pepper plants. We talked about gardening and the weather and the neighborhood, and it was the most comfortable conversation I had had with a man in years. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" he asked as we were packing up our tools. "I know a nice place that's not too far from here." I was so surprised that I almost said no automatically. I wasn't ready to date, wasn't sure I would ever be ready to trust another man with my heart or my life. But then I looked at Frank, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't seen in decades: respect. He was asking me out because he enjoyed my company, not because he needed someone to cook his meals or iron his shirts or stroke his ego. He saw me as an equal, a person worth getting to know better. "Yes," I said, surprising myself. "I'd like that." Our first coffee date was awkward and sweet and nothing like the romantic dinners Robert used to take me on when we were young. We talked about our children and our gardens and the books we were reading. Frank listened when I spoke and asked follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely interested in what I had to say. We've been having coffee together once a week for 3 months now, and I've started looking forward to our conversations more than I expected. Frank makes me laugh, and more importantly, he treats my thoughts and opinions as valuable. When I told him about my marriage, he was appalled by the way Robert had treated me. "You deserved better," he said simply, and somehow those 3 words meant more to me than all the sympathy and platitudes I had received from well-meaning friends. I'm not in love with Frank, and I don't think I ever will be in love that way again. But I enjoy his company, and more importantly, I enjoy the woman I am when I'm with him. I'm interesting and funny and worth spending time with, not because I'm providing a service but because I'm good company. That's something I had forgotten about myself, and I'm grateful to have remembered it. Fall arrived with its familiar routine of shorter days and cooler weather, but this year felt different. Instead of dreading the approach of winter and the holidays I would spend alone, I found myself excited about the possibilities ahead. I had saved enough money to take a week-long trip to Vermont, something I had always wanted to do but never suggested because Robert hated traveling. I booked a room at a bed and breakfast in a small town where the leaves would be changing, and I planned to spend my days walking and reading and talking to strangers in cafes. The night before I left, Sarah called to check on me. "Are you sure you'll be okay traveling alone, Mom? What if something happens?" "Then I'll handle it," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not as helpless as you think I am." "I know you're not helpless," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that you've never done anything like this before." She was right. I had never traveled alone, never made major decisions without consulting someone else, never trusted my own judgment completely. But maybe it was time to start. The trip to Vermont was everything I had hoped it would be and more. I drove my own route at my own pace, stopping when something caught my interest and moving on when I was ready. I ate meals alone in small restaurants without feeling self-conscious, and I struck up conversations with other travelers and locals who were happy to share their recommendations for hiking trails and antique shops. On my last day, I hiked to the top of a small mountain and sat on a rock outcropping overlooking a valley painted in autumn colors. The view was breathtaking, but what struck me most was the silence. Not the oppressive silence of my lonely marriage, but the peaceful silence of solitude chosen rather than imposed. I sat there for over an hour, just breathing and thinking and being present in my own life in a way I hadn't been for decades. I thought about the woman who had married Robert 44 years ago, so eager to please and so afraid of being alone. I thought about the woman who had sat in that kitchen last winter, listening to her husband announce that he had found someone better. And I thought about the woman I was becoming: independent, curious, strong enough to climb mountains and confident enough to travel alone. All 3 of those women were me, different chapters in the same story, and I was finally ready to see where the story would go next. I took a photograph of the view with my new camera, but I also took a mental picture that I knew I would carry with me forever. This moment of complete contentment, of being exactly where I wanted to be and exactly who I wanted to be, was worth every hour of loneliness and confusion I had endured to get here. The drive home was bittersweet, but I was surprised to realize I was actually looking forward to returning to my apartment. It wasn't the home I had shared with Robert anymore, it was my home, arranged according to my preferences and filled with things that made me happy. When I walked through the door, Mrs. Chen was waiting in the hallway with my mail and a plate of dumplings she had made while I was away. "How was your trip?" she asked, and when I started telling her about the mountains and the bed and breakfast and the strangers who had become temporary friends, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You look different," she said, the same thing Emma had noticed months earlier. "You look like yourself." Like myself. I had been so many things to so many people for so long that I had forgotten what myself looked like. But I was beginning to remember, and I liked what I saw. That evening, I called Sarah and Michael to let them know I was back safely. Their voices carried a new note of respect that hadn't been there before, as if my successful solo trip had proven something important about my capabilities. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Michael said, and I could tell he meant it. "You're handling all of this better than any of us expected." Better than any of us expected. The phrase stung a little because it revealed how little faith my own children had had in my strength and resilience. But it also made me proud because I was exceeding their expectations and, more importantly, my own. As winter approached, I found myself busier than I had been in years. I was taking a photography class at the community center, volunteering at the local library, and planning another trip, this time to see the cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C. in the spring. Frank and I had progressed from coffee dates to dinner dates, and occasionally we went to movies or concerts together. We were taking things slowly, both of us wary of rushing into anything serious, but I enjoyed having someone to share experiences with. One evening in November, we were walking through the neighborhood after dinner when we passed the restaurant where I had seen Robert with Linda 6 months earlier. I felt a small pang of something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite nostalgia, just a recognition of how much had changed since that rainy October afternoon. "You okay?" Frank asked, noticing my pause. "Yes," I said, and I was surprised to realize it was true. I was just thinking about how different my life is now compared to a year ago. Different good or different bad? I considered the question seriously. A year ago, I was married but lonely, financially secure but emotionally bankrupt, surrounded by family but invisible to the people who were supposed to love me most. Now I was divorced and living on a limited income, but I was also free to make my own choices and discover who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs and expectations. I had less money but more joy, fewer people in my daily life but deeper connections with the ones who remained. Different good, I said finally. Definitely different good. The holidays that first year after my divorce were challenging but manageable. Sarah invited me to spend Christmas with her family, and I went, but I also made it clear that I would be leaving by evening to spend the night in my own apartment. I was no longer willing to sacrifice my comfort or preferences for the sake of keeping everyone else happy. Christmas dinner was pleasant but not perfect, which was a relief after decades of trying to orchestrate flawless family gatherings. Emma and Jake gave me a photo album they had made of our trip to the Botanical Gardens in Queens, and Michael gave me a Barnes & Noble gift card that showed he had noticed my renewed love of reading. Robert wasn't mentioned, which was probably for the best. I learned later from Sarah that he and Linda had gotten married in a small ceremony in December, but the news didn't hurt as much as I had expected it would. If anything, I felt a kind of detached curiosity about what their life together was like. New Year's Eve found me at home alone, but not lonely. I made popcorn and watched old movies, and when midnight came, I toasted myself with a glass of wine and made a resolution to continue becoming the woman I was meant to be all along. The second year of my new life brought additional changes and unexpected opportunities. My photography skills had improved enough that I started selling some of my pictures at a local art fair, earning small amounts of money that were mine alone. The income wasn't significant, but the recognition was deeply satisfying. I also began writing again seriously for the first time in decades. Not the children's stories I had dreamed of long ago, but memoir pieces about late-life reinvention and the unexpected gifts of solitude. A local magazine published one of my essays, and seeing my name in print gave me a thrill I hadn't experienced since high school. Frank remained a steady presence in my life, though we both understood that what we had was companionship rather than romance. We traveled together occasionally, taking bus tours and weekend trips that were comfortable and enriching without being passionate. It was exactly the kind of relationship I needed at this stage of my life, mutual respect and shared interests without the complications of trying to blend two fully formed lives. Sarah and Michael continued to adjust to having a mother who was independent and decisive rather than passive and accommodating. Sometimes they seemed frustrated by my new assertiveness, especially when I declined invitations or made plans without consulting them first. "You're different, Mom," Sarah said during one of our phone conversations, and her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the changes. "I hope so," I replied. "I like who I'm becoming. But you seem so separate from us now. Like you don't need us anymore." Her words revealed the uncomfortable truth that none of us had wanted to acknowledge. My children had grown accustomed to having a mother who existed primarily to serve their needs and validate their choices. Now that I was living for myself, they weren't sure where they fit into my life. "I do need you," I said carefully. "I need you to be my children, to love me and let me love you. I don't need you to take care of me or make decisions for me anymore, but that doesn't mean I don't want you in my life." It took time for us to figure out this new dynamic, but gradually we found our way to relationships that were more balanced and honest than what we had before. Sarah began asking for my advice about her own marriage, recognizing that perhaps I had learned something valuable from the failure of mine. Michael started calling just to chat, rather than only when he was checking up on my welfare. The twins, now college sophomores, treated me with a new kind of respect that was both touching and amusing. They introduced me to their friends as their badass grandma and bragged about my photography and writing accomplishments. Their pride in my independence was a gift I hadn't expected. By the third year after my divorce, I had established routines and relationships that felt sustainable and fulfilling. I woke each morning curious about what the day would bring rather than dreading the hours ahead. I made plans based on my own interests rather than other people's expectations. I won't pretend it was always easy. There were lonely evenings and financial worries and moments when I questioned whether I had made the right choices. But even the difficult times felt authentic in a way that my married life never had. I was facing my problems honestly rather than pretending they didn't exist. One evening last spring, I was walking through the community garden where I had first met Frank when I encountered a woman about my age sitting on a bench, crying quietly. She looked lost and heartbroken, and something about her expression reminded me of myself on that terrible night when Robert had announced he was leaving me. I sat down beside her and introduced myself. Her name was Helen, and she had just discovered that her husband of 38 years was having an affair with his secretary. The story was depressingly familiar, but her pain was fresh and raw and overwhelming. "I don't know what to do," she said through her tears. "I don't know how to live without him. I don't know how to be alone." I listened while she talked, remembering how isolated and terrified I had felt in those first weeks after Robert left. When she finished, I told her my own story, about the family dinner and the casual cruelty and the months of confusion and despair that had followed. "But you seem so confident now," she said. "So sure of yourself." "It took time," I admitted. "And it wasn't easy. But I learned something important. I'd rather be alone than with someone who makes me feel invisible." I gave Helen my phone number and told her to call if she needed someone to talk to who would understand what she was going through. Over the following months, I watched her transform in much the same way I had, from a broken woman who defined herself through her marriage to an independent person discovering her own strength. Helping Helen reminded me how far I had come and how much I had learned about resilience and reinvention. It also made me realize that my experience, painful as it had been, might have value for other women facing similar challenges. I started volunteering with a support group for women going through late-life divorces, sharing my story and offering practical advice about everything from opening bank accounts to traveling alone. The work was deeply satisfying in a way that nothing in my married life had ever been. These women reminded me of myself 3 years ago, terrified, financially dependent, convinced they were too old to start over. Watching them discover their own strength and independence was like witnessing a series of small miracles. "You saved my life," one of them told me after our group had finished a session on financial planning. "I mean that literally. I was so depressed after my husband left that I didn't think I could go on. But seeing what you've accomplished gives me hope." I hugged her and remembered Mrs. Chen's words from that first terrible night, "You are stronger than you know." It had taken me decades to understand what she meant, but now I knew it was true, not just for me but for all the women who thought they were too old, too tired, too broken to rebuild their lives. Today, as I sit in my apartment writing this story, I can see my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me is 75 years old, with gray hair and lines around her eyes and hands that show the wear of 3/4 of a century of living. But more than that, she is a woman who has claimed her own space in the world, who travels alone and makes her own decisions and surrounds herself with people who value her company rather than her services. Who has learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between being loved and being needed. The apartment around me reflects who I am now rather than who I was expected to be. My books fill the shelves where Robert's golf magazines used to sit. My photographs hang on the walls where his bowling trophies used to gather dust. My reading chair sits by the window in the best light, and my coffee mug waits on the kitchen counter for tomorrow morning's quiet ritual. This is my home now, truly mine in a way it never was when I shared it with someone who took my presence for granted. Every object, every arrangement, every choice reflects my preferences and priorities. It's not a museum to someone else's comfort but a living space that nurtures my own growth and happiness. Frank still comes by occasionally, and we still take our photography walks and attend concerts together. Sarah calls every week, and our conversations are honest and warm now that neither of us is pretending to be someone we're not. Michael brings his new girlfriend for dinner sometimes, and I enjoy cooking for people who appreciate the effort as well as the food. The twins are graduating from college next month, and they've asked me to come to the ceremony. Not because they feel sorry for their divorced grandmother, but because they're proud of me and want me to share their celebration. Emma is planning to teach elementary school, and she's asked for copies of the children's stories I've been writing. Jake is going to law school, and he says I inspired him to believe that it's never too late to pursue your dreams. I think about Robert sometimes, but rarely with bitterness. I heard through Sarah that he and Linda are having problems, that the age difference is more challenging than he expected, that she doesn't appreciate his jokes the way she used to. Part of me feels sorry for him, approaching his 74th birthday with a young wife who is discovering that being married to an elderly man isn't as romantic as she thought it would be. Mostly, though, I feel grateful. Grateful that he forced me to leave a marriage that was suffocating me slowly. Grateful that I discovered my own strength before it was too late. Grateful for the opportunity to write the final chapters of my life according to my own vision rather than someone else's expectations. The story I'm telling you today isn't finished yet. I don't know what the next chapters will bring, but I know I'll face them with confidence and curiosity rather than fear and resignation. I know that whatever happens, I'll handle it, because I've learned that I'm capable of much more than I ever imagined. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in my experiences, if you're feeling invisible in your own life or taken for granted by people who should cherish you, I want you to know that it's not too late. It's never too late to reclaim your own story, to remember who you were before you defined yourself only in relation to other people. You are stronger than you know. You deserve better than settling for scraps of attention and affection. You have value that exists independent of your usefulness to others. The end of one story can be the beginning of another, better one. The person you become after loss can be more authentic and fulfilled than the person you were before. Freedom, even when it comes at a price you didn't want to pay, can be the greatest gift you never knew you needed. Take it from someone who learned these lessons later than she should have, but not too late to matter. You are worth fighting for, especially when the person you're fighting for is yourself. Have you lived through something similar to what I've shared today? Have you found the courage to choose yourself even when it felt impossible? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult but important conversations, and it might help this message reach someone who desperately needs to know they're not alone. Remember, the end of one chapter is just the beginning of another, and sometimes the most beautiful stories start with what feels like the most devastating endings.